Jack Wilson never thought he'd own a piece of land this big. At 42 years old, after spending most of his adult life designing buildings for other people in the city, he finally had a place to call his own. The old Taylor farmhouse wasn't much to look at when he first saw it online. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, and windows that had seen better days, but there was something about those 5 acres of green Pennsylvania countryside that called to him. "You're crazy," his friends told him when he announced he was leaving his comfortable apartment to fix up a rundown farmhouse 2 hours from the nearest city. Maybe they were right. But after his divorce last year, Jack needed something new, something that was just his. The house itself needed work, but Jack saw potential where others saw problems. High ceilings that could be restored, wooden floors hidden under old carpets, a kitchen that with some love could be the heart of a home again. The real estate agent had seemed surprised when Jack made an offer after just one visit. The place had been on the market for almost 2 years. "It's pretty isolated," she warned, "and there's a lot of land to take care of." Jack had just smiled. "That's exactly what I want." 3 months after moving in, Jack had settled into a new routine. Mornings were for his remote architecture work. The firm had been surprisingly okay with him working from home. Afternoons were for tackling the endless projects the old house presented. And evenings were for sitting on his newly fixed porch watching the sunset with a cold beer, listening to the crickets and wondering why he hadn't done this years ago. It was on a Saturday in early fall when Jack decided to finally deal with the overgrown mess at the far edge of his property. Armed with work gloves, boots, and tools, he made his way through the tall grass toward the tree line. The previous owners had clearly given up on maintaining this area long ago. Brambles caught at his jeans, and branches seemed to reach out to block his path. But Jack was determined. He'd seen this part of the property from his upstairs window, and had been curious about the small hill that rose up at the edge of the woods. The work was harder than he expected. Years of neglect had turned this corner of the property into a tangle of vines, bushes, and small trees. Jack's shirt stuck to his back with sweat as he cut through the undergrowth. The sun was high overhead when he finally reached the base of the small hill. That's when he saw it. At first, Jack thought it was just an unusual rock formation, something that happened naturally over time. But as he pulled away the thick curtain of ivy, a chill ran down his spine despite the warm day. There, built right into the hillside, was a door. Not a modern door, this was old. Very old. Made of thick wooden planks held together with iron bands. It looked like something from another century. A heavy padlock, orange with rust, hung from a metal loop. "What the hell?" Jack whispered to himself, his voice sounding strange in the quiet of the woods. He stepped back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His property had once been farmland, according to the real estate listing. Nothing had mentioned any structures beyond the house and the old barn. Certainly nothing about a door built into a hillside like something from a fairy tale. Jack pulled out his phone and took several pictures, moving around to capture the door from different angles. The stones around the frame were carefully placed. This wasn't some quick project. Someone had taken time to build this, to hide it away on this remote piece of land. As he cleared more vegetation, Jack noticed that the hill itself seemed oddly shaped, too regular to be natural. Could it be covering something bigger? A root cellar, perhaps? But why so far from the house? A normal person might have walked away, might have decided that strange doors locked up and hidden on their property were best left alone. But Jack had always been too curious for his own good. It was what made him a good architect, always wanting to see how things worked, what was behind walls, how spaces connected. That evening, instead of enjoying his usual porch sunset, Jack sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, a notepad beside him filled with scribbles. The property records showed the farmhouse had been built in 1910 by a family named Taylor, who had owned it until 1973. After that, it had changed hands several times, never staying with one owner for more than a decade. Nothing in the official records mentioned any structure where Jack had found the door. But an old survey map from the county archives showed something interesting, a dotted line running from the direction of the hill toward the west, marked only with the letters PC. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He'd been staring at the screen for hours. Outside, the sky had grown dark, and his reflection stared back at him from the window. Tomorrow, he decided he would ask around town. Someone local must know something about a door in a hillside. The next day found Jack at the small diner in town, the only place open on Sundays. He'd become something of a regular, coming in for breakfast when his own cooking skills failed him. The older woman who usually served him, Betty, smiled as he took his usual seat at the counter. "Morning, city boy. The usual?" Jack nodded, then hesitated. "Betty, I found something strange on my property yesterday." A door, built into a small hill at the edge of the woods. Betty's hand paused as she poured his coffee. It was just for a moment, but Jack caught it. She knew something. "The old root cellar, probably," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Lots of farms had them back in the day. This doesn't look like any root cellar I've ever seen, and it's too far from the house." Betty set down the coffee pot and glanced around the nearly empty diner. She leaned in slightly. "That land has history, you know. Before the Taylors bought it." "What kind of history?" Betty straightened up as the cook called that an order was ready. "You should talk to old Pete down at the hardware store. His grandfather worked the mines around here." "Mines?" Jack repeated, surprised. "There were mines on my property?" "Not exactly on your property, but nearby." Betty moved away to serve another customer, clearly done with the conversation. Mines. That could explain it. Jack found himself eating quickly, eager to get to the hardware store when it opened at noon. His mind raced with possibilities. A mine entrance? But why would it be locked? And why wasn't it on any of the property records? The hardware store was housed in a brick building that had probably been there since the town was founded. A bell jingled as Jack pushed open the door. The place smelled of sawdust and metal, shelves packed with tools and supplies. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with thick glasses and hands spotted with age. "Can I help you find something?" the man asked. "Are you Pete?" When the man nodded, Jack continued. "I'm Jack Wilson. I bought the old Taylor farm a few months ago." Something flickered across Pete's face. Recognition? Concern? It was gone too quickly for Jack to be sure. "Betty at the diner said I should talk to you. I found a door built into a hillside on my property yesterday. She mentioned your grandfather worked in mines around here." Pete was silent for a long moment, studying Jack's face. Finally, he sighed. "Not many folks remember the mining days around here. Company closed down in '32 during the Depression. My grandfather was one of the last workers." "Was there mining on my land? The old Taylor place?" "Not exactly." Pete came out from behind the counter, moving slowly. "Come on back to the office. I've got some old maps that might help explain." Jack followed the old man through a doorway into a small, cluttered office. Pete rummaged through a filing cabinet before pulling out a large, yellowed map. He spread it on the desk, weights on each corner, keeping it flat. "This is from 1925, Pete explained. The Black Ridge Mining Company owned most of the land around here back then." His finger traced over the map. "This was their main operation, about 2 miles west of your place. But they had exploratory tunnels all over." His finger moved to where Jack's property would be. "They found some promising veins here, started some test tunnels. But then there was an accident." "What kind of accident?" Jack asked, a knot forming in his stomach. Pete looked up at him, his eyes magnified behind the thick glasses. "Cave-in. 3 men died. After that, they sealed up the tunnels and abandoned that section. The company sold off that parcel a few years later. That's when the Taylors bought it." Jack stared at the map, at the thin lines marking tunnel entrances. One of them had to be the door he'd found. "So that door, it leads to an old mine tunnel. One where people died?" Pete nodded slowly. "My grandfather always said they should have filled those tunnels in, not just sealed them. Said it wasn't right leaving them there like tombs." A chill ran through Jack. What had seemed like an exciting discovery now felt ominous. "Has anyone ever opened it? Since it was sealed?" Pete shook his head. "Not that I know of. Most folks around here know to leave it be." He fixed Jack with a steady gaze. "Some things are locked up for a reason." Jack nodded, but already he could feel that pull of curiosity. He wanted to know what was behind that door. Wanted to see those tunnels with his own eyes. Wanted to understand the history hidden beneath his own land. As he drove home, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the fields, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the door. About what might lie beyond it. About the men who had died there. Some things are locked up for a reason, Pete had said. But Jack had always been the type to open closed doors. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, and he saw that weathered door set into the hillside, imagined what might be waiting behind it. The warning from old Pete kept echoing in his mind. Some things are locked up for a reason. But Jack had never been good at leaving mysteries alone. That's what had drawn him to architecture in the first place, the desire to understand how things were built, how spaces connected, what secrets lay beneath the surface. Monday morning, instead of logging onto his work computer, Jack found himself driving to the county records office. The building was a drab concrete structure that seemed designed to discourage visitors, with flickering fluorescent lights and a musty smell that hinted at decades of paperwork, slowly decaying in filing cabinets. The clerk at the front desk looked surprised to have a visitor. She was a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and she peered at Jack with undisguised curiosity when he explained what he was looking for. Mining records from the 1920s? For the Blackridge Company? She frowned. Those would be in the basement archives if we have them. Not many folks ask about the old mines these days. Jack followed her down a narrow staircase into a basement that felt more like a cave than a government building. Row after row of metal shelving stretched into the shadows, loaded with boxes and binders. County only started keeping digital records in '98, the clerk explained as she ran her finger along the shelves. Anything before that, you've got to hunt for it the old-fashioned way. It took nearly 2 hours of searching before Jack found what he was looking for, a thick folder labeled Blackridge Mining, cost 1918-1932. His hands were dusty as he opened it, spreading the contents on a small table set up for researchers. Most of it was boring business paperwork, tax forms, equipment purchases, payroll records. But near the back of the folder, Jack found a newspaper clipping from October 1928. The headline made his blood run cold. 3 dead in mine collapse. Blackridge halts east operations. The article was short but grim. An exploratory tunnel had collapsed without warning, trapping 4 miners. 1 had been rescued, but 3 others had died before help could reach them. The company had immediately sealed the eastern tunnels and focused operations on their western claims. Jack read the article twice, noting that the eastern tunnels would have been the ones on what was now his property. The article mentioned the miners by name: Harold Larson, George Wilson, and Frank Kovach. Jack paused at the second name, wondering if this Wilson was somehow related to him. It wasn't an uncommon name, but the coincidence felt strange. There was more. A company memo dated November 1928 detailed the permanent sealing of the east tunnels to prevent further incidents and to respect the final resting place of our fallen men. Jack's stomach turned at the realization they had never recovered the bodies. The sealed tunnels were essentially graves. The last document in the folder was the most interesting: a detailed map of the mine workings as they stood in 1928. Jack carefully took photos of it with his phone, along with the newspaper article and company memo. The map showed a network of tunnels spreading out from 3 main entrances. One of those entrances was exactly where Jack had found the door on his property. Find what you were looking for? The clerk asked when Jack finally emerged from the basement, blinking in the relative brightness of the main floor. I think so, he said, not sure how to feel about what he discovered. Did you know there are men still buried in those old mines? The clerk nodded. My grandfather used to tell stories about the Blackridge disaster. Said the company could have gotten those men out, but it would have cost too much. Cheaper to seal the tunnels and call it a day. She shook her head. Different times back then. Jack drove home slowly, his mind racing. The door he'd found wasn't just an entrance to an abandoned mine. It was the sealed portal to what amounted to a mass grave. The proper thing to do would be to leave it alone, to respect the dead. But as he pulled into his driveway, another thought struck him. What if the company memo had been a lie? What if they sealed the tunnels not out of respect, but to hide something? Mining companies back then weren't known for their ethics or transparency. Over the next few days, Jack tried to focus on his work, on the house renovations that still needed his attention. But his thoughts kept returning to the door in the hillside. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, feeling a strange pull toward it, as if it were calling to him. On Wednesday afternoon, he gave in to his curiosity and hiked back out to the hill. The door looked the same as before, old, weathered, firmly sealed with that rusted padlock. Jack ran his hand over the rough wood, feeling the textures left by nearly a century of exposure to the elements. "What are you hiding?" he whispered. That evening, Jack found himself researching mining disasters of the early 20th century. The story was always the same: Companies cutting corners on safety, workers paying the price with their lives, corporations covering up their negligence. The more he read, the more convinced he became that there might be more to the Black Ridge disaster than what was in the official record. His investigation took a new turn on Friday when he visited the local historical society. Housed in what had once been the town's first schoolhouse, the volunteer on duty, an enthusiastic history teacher named Tom, lit up when Jack mentioned the Black Ridge mine. "Oh, that's a fascinating piece of local history," Tom said, leading Jack to a glass case displaying mining artifacts. "Not many people know about it anymore, but it was a big deal back in the day." "I'm particularly interested in the 1928 collapse," Jack said. "The one where 3 miners died." Tom's smile faded slightly. "Ah, yes. That was a tragedy, but also a bit of a mystery. What do you mean?" Tom glanced around, though they were the only people in the small museum. "Well, there are some local stories that don't quite match the official account. The company claimed it was a natural collapse, but some folks said there was more to it." Jack leaned forward. "What kind of stories?" "There was one survivor, right? A man named Patrick Riley. After the accident, he started telling anyone who would listen that the collapse wasn't natural, that they had broken into something in the tunnel, something that shouldn't have been disturbed." Tom shrugged. "Riley was found dead a month later. Officially ruled a suicide, but people had their doubts," Jack finished. Tom nodded. "Mining towns were rough places. Companies had a lot of power. If someone was causing trouble, spreading stories that might hurt the company's reputation or finances, they might make that trouble go away," Jack said quietly. "I'm not saying that's what happened," Tom added quickly, "just that there are stories." Before Jack left, Tom showed him the Historical Society's prized possession, a journal kept by one of the Black Ridge mine supervisors from 1925 to 1930. Most of the entries were mundane notes about work progress and problems with equipment, but the entry from the day of the collapse caught Jack's attention. "Incident in East Tunnel 3 today. Men broke through to a natural cavity. LW and K lost. Riley survived but is not making sense. Says they found something down there. Company sealing the tunnel tomorrow. No recovery attempt to be made." Tom didn't have an explanation for what the something might have been.
Cave systems, maybe?
"This area has some limestone formations. Or maybe Riley was just in shock seeing things that weren't there." But Jack wasn't so sure. As he drove home, the pieces began to come together in his mind. The hastily sealed tunnel, the survivor who died under suspicious circumstances after telling strange stories, the company's decision to abandon what might have been a promising mining area. What if they had found something down there? Something valuable, or something else? By the time Saturday rolled around, Jack's curiosity had become an obsession. He barely slept, spending hours poring over the mine maps he'd photographed, comparing them to topographical maps of his property, trying to understand what might lie beneath his land. That morning, he found himself at the hardware store filling a cart with items: a heavy-duty bolt cutter, extra batteries for his flashlight, a hard hat, work gloves, rope, a dust mask. Old Pete watched him from behind the counter, his roomy eyes narrowing as he rang up the purchases. "Planning some projects?" he asked, his tone making it clear he knew exactly what Jack was planning. "Just some basic supplies," Jack said, not meeting the old man's gaze. Pete finished ringing up the items, then paused before handing over the receipt. "My grandfather had a saying about curiosity. Said it was like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get." "I just want to see what's there," Jack said. "I'm not planning to disturb anything." "That's how it always starts," Pete replied, his voice low. "Just looking. But some things change you once you've seen them. Some knowledge you can't unlearn." He pushed the receipt across the counter. "Whatever you find behind that door, be sure you're ready for it." Jack nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere, already imagining the tunnel beyond the door, already wondering what secrets had been locked away all these years. As he loaded his purchases into his truck, Jack felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, fear, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. A sense that once he opened that door, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sky was overcast, promising rain later. Perfect, Jack thought. No one would be out hiking near his property in weather like this, no one to see what he was about to do. The door in the hillside was waiting for him just as it had waited for nearly a century. Today its long vigil would end. The bolt cutter was heavier than Jack expected. He positioned the blades around the rusted padlock, his breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. For a moment he hesitated. Old Pete's warning echoed in his mind. Some things change you once you've seen them. Was he really ready for whatever lay beyond this door? But the pull of the unknown was too strong. Jack squeezed the handles of the bolt cutter, straining against the resistance. For a second nothing happened. Then with a sharp crack that seemed too loud in the quiet woods, the lock broke apart, pieces falling to the ground at his feet. Jack stared at the broken lock. That sound felt final somehow, like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it was too late for second thoughts now. He slipped the heavy chain free from the door handles and let it fall with a dull thud. The door didn't want to open at first. Decades of soil and plant growth had sealed the edges as surely as any lock. Jack had to use a shovel to clear away the dirt and pry at the edges with a crowbar before it finally budged. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. As the door swung outward, a rush of cool, damp air escaped from the darkness beyond. It carried a musty smell like old books left too long in a basement, mixed with something earthier and less pleasant. Jack flipped on his heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal rough-hewn stone walls and a dirt floor. "Here we go," Jack whispered to himself, securing the hard hat on his head and adjusting the dust mask over his nose and mouth. He'd read enough about old mines to know they could contain dangerous gases or dust. Better safe than sorry. The tunnel entrance was about 6 feet tall, forcing Jack to duck his head slightly as he stepped inside. The walls were supported by old wooden beams that looked surprisingly intact given their age. The beam of his flashlight showed the tunnel stretching away into darkness, sloping gently downward. Jack's footsteps sounded strangely muffled on the dirt floor. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds of traffic. Just his breathing and the soft crunch of his boots. He moved slowly, sweeping his light across the walls and ceiling, alert for any signs of instability. About 20 feet in, he found the first evidence of the tunnel's purpose. A rusted pickaxe leaning against the wall, its wooden handle rotted and broken. Next to it lay what might have been a lunch pail, now just a collapsed rectangle of rusted metal. Someone's everyday tools, abandoned for almost 100 years. The tunnel continued straight for another 50 yards before it branched. A wooden sign, its paint long since faded, marked the split. East 3, with an arrow pointing to the right. East 2, with an arrow pointing left. Jack consulted the mine map he'd photographed. The collapse had happened in East Tunnel 3, the right fork. Logic told him to take the left path, the one that should still be intact. But the mystery that had drawn him here lay down the right fork. What had they found? What had scared the mining company enough to seal an entire section without even retrieving their dead? Jack chose the right path. East Tunnel 3 looked much like the main passage, rough walls, wooden supports, dirt floor. But as he moved deeper, Jack noticed changes. The tunnel widened in places and the marks on the walls became more erratic, less like the methodical work of miners following a vein of coal or ore. Something glinted in his flashlight beam. Jack knelt down to examine it, a brass button tarnished green with age. He picked it up, rubbing off some of the corrosion with his thumb. It looked like it might have come from a work uniform. Probably belonged to one of the miners who died here, Jack murmured, pocketing the button. It felt strange to touch something that might have belonged to one of the men whose final moments had played out in this dark place. About 500 feet in, the tunnel began to change more dramatically. The ceiling rose higher and the walls curved outward, creating a more natural-looking space. Jack realized he was no longer in an entirely man-made tunnel. The miners had broken through into what appeared to be a natural cave system. The air felt different here, still cool, but somehow fresher, with a mineral tang to it. Jack's light revealed stalactites hanging from the ceiling, some as thin as pencils, others as thick as tree trunks. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady plink, plink, plink that echoed in the chamber. And there was something else. As Jack moved his light across the far wall of the cave, he caught a glimpse of color that seemed out of place in the monochrome world of stone and dirt. He moved closer, his heartbeat quickening. It was a painting. No, not a painting. A cave drawing like the ancient ones found in places like France and Spain. But this was impossible. There were no known prehistoric cave paintings in Pennsylvania. Jack stared at the image, trying to make sense of it. It showed stick-figure humans with what looked like spears, surrounding a much larger figure. The large figure was drawn in a deep red color that still seemed vivid despite its obvious age. But what struck Jack most was how unnatural the large figure appeared. Its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, head too large and oddly shaped. Was it wearing some kind of mask or headdress? Or was it meant to be something not human? What the hell were these? Jack whispered, his voice sounding strange in the cave. He took several photos with his phone, the flash briefly illuminating the chamber. That's when he noticed there were more drawings, stretching around the curve of the cave wall. They seemed to tell a story, the strange figures and the humans at first separate, then interacting in ways Jack couldn't quite interpret. Some scenes looked peaceful, others decidedly less so. Jack lost track of time as he followed the drawings, moving deeper into the cave system. His flashlight caught other signs of human presence, more recent ones. A rusted lantern, a wooden crate stenciled with Black Ridge Mining Co., a pickaxe embedded in the wall as if dropped in a hurry, and then he saw it, a pile of rubble that stretched from floor to ceiling. The collapse. This had to be where the tunnel had caved in, killing 3 men and sealing off whatever lay beyond. Jack approached it cautiously, playing his light over the jumbled rocks and splintered support beams. Something caught his eye, a glint of metal among the rubble. Jack moved closer, careful where he placed his feet. Half buried under smaller rocks was what appeared to be a metal box, about the size of a small suitcase. It looked like it had been caught in the collapse, crushed on one side but still intact enough that Jack could see it had a handle and what might be a latch. With careful movements, Jack began clearing away the smaller rocks around the box. It was slow work. He had to test each piece before moving it, making sure it wasn't supporting other parts of the rubble pile. One wrong move could trigger another collapse. Finally, the box was free enough that Jack could pull it out. It was heavier than he expected, and whatever was inside shifted with a sound like sand or gravel. The latch was stuck, either locked or rusted shut. Jack decided to take it back to the house where he could open it properly. As he turned to leave, his foot knocked loose a small stone. It skittered across the cave floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Jack froze, listening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard it. A low rumble, more felt than heard, coming from somewhere deep in the rock around him. A fine shower of dust fell from the ceiling. Not good, Jack muttered, tucking the metal box under his arm and starting to move back toward the entrance. Faster now. The rumbling grew louder. Larger pieces began to fall, pebbles, then rocks bouncing off his hard hat with sharp cracks. Jack broke into a run, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly over the uneven floor of the tunnel. Behind him, the rumble became a roar as more of the ceiling gave way. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe even through his mask. He could see the branch in the tunnel ahead. If he could just make it past that point, back to the main passage, he might be safe. The box was slowing him down, but Jack refused to drop it. Whatever was inside, it might be his only clue to what the miners had discovered. Just as he reached the junction, a massive crack split the air. Jack dove forward as a section of tunnel behind him collapsed completely, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. He lay on the ground for a moment, heart pounding, dust settling on his back and in his hair. When he finally pushed himself up and looked back, Jack saw that East Tunnel 3 was gone, sealed once again by tons of rock and dirt. If he'd been a few seconds slower, Jack didn't linger. He half ran, half stumbled back toward daylight, the metal box clutched tightly against his chest. Only when he emerged into the gray afternoon light, gulping in fresh air, did he allow himself to think about how close he'd come to sharing the fate of those long-dead miners. But despite the danger, or maybe because of it, Jack felt exhilarated. He had discovered something in that cave, something that shouldn't exist. Ancient cave paintings in Pennsylvania? And what was in this box? Whatever secrets lay behind that door, Jack was now part of them. As if responding to his thoughts, the metal box seemed to grow warmer against his chest. Probably just his imagination, Jack told himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that opening the box would be crossing another line, perhaps the last one. Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at the metal box he'd nearly died retrieving. After escaping the tunnel collapse, he'd stumbled home, covered in dust and dirt, his hands shaking from adrenaline. He'd showered, changed his clothes, and made himself a strong cup of coffee, all while avoiding looking directly at the box. Now, with evening shadows stretching across his kitchen floor, he couldn't put it off any longer. The box was roughly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and about 8 inches deep. What he'd thought was rust turned out to be dried clay and dirt, caked onto the metal surface. After scrubbing it clean in the utility sink, Jack could see it was made of some kind of dark, burnished metal, not steel or iron, but something that reminded him of bronze. Though different somehow, there were no visible hinges. The lid and body appeared to be cast as separate pieces, with the lid designed to fit snugly over the top. Strange symbols were etched into the metal. Not any writing system Jack recognized, but definitely intentional markings, too precise to be random. "What were you doing in a coal mine in Pennsylvania?" Jack muttered, running his finger over the symbols. The latch was stuck, either jammed by the collapse or locked. Jack tried prying it with a screwdriver, then a butter knife, but it wouldn't budge. Finally, he resorted to more aggressive means, wedging the tip of the crowbar from his toolbox under the edge of the lid and applying steady pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a sound like breaking glass, though nothing visible broke, and the lid popped free with unexpected ease, nearly sending Jack tumbling backward. A faint odor emerged from the open box, something like wet stone and old pennies with an undertone Jack couldn't place. He hesitated, then directed his desk lamp to shine into the box. Inside, nestled in what looked like dark sand or soil, lay 3 objects. The first was a stone disc about 6 inches across, covered in the same strange symbols as the outside of the box. The disc had a hole in the center and appeared to be made of the same material as the cave walls, likely carved by the same people who made the cave paintings. The second object was a small figurine, maybe 4 inches tall, depicting what looked like the same elongated figure from the cave drawings. Up close, the proportions were even more unsettling. Limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places, the head oversized and oddly shaped. It wasn't threatening exactly, but looking at it for too long made Jack's eyes water, as if his brain couldn't quite process the proportions. The third object made Jack's breath catch. It was a leather pouch, cracked and dried with age but remarkably intact. On the front was stitched a familiar emblem, the logo of the Black Ridge Mining Company, the same one he'd seen on their letterhead in the county archives. Jack carefully removed the pouch and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and so brittle he feared it might crumble at his touch. With delicate movements, he unfolded it on the table. It was a letter, handwritten in faded ink. October 12th, 1928, to whoever finds this. If you're reading this, then God help you, because you've already gone too far. My name is Patrick Riley. I was a miner with Black Ridge. 3 days ago, our team broke through into a cave no human eyes were ever meant to see. We found drawings on the walls, artifacts in the dirt, things that don't belong in this world, things that don't make sense. Larson wanted to bring it all to the surface, said we'd be famous, rich. Kovac agreed. Wilson was the only one who understood the danger, who felt what I felt. The wrongness of it all. I tried to warn them not to touch anything. They wouldn't listen. They found the metal container, forced it open despite the symbols that even an uneducated man like me could tell were warnings. What came after, I cannot fully describe. The shadows moved. The air itself seemed to bend. Larson, Kovac, and Wilson were gone in moments, though their screams lasted much longer. I ran, the tunnel collapsed behind me. I told them it was a natural cave-in. What else could I say? But I went back later alone. Found another way in through an old shaft. Recovered the box, sealed it as best I could. Tried to bury it deep where no one would find it. But I know now I can't destroy it. And I know they're looking for me. If you've found this, if you've opened the box, then it's already too late. They know they're coming. I'm sorry. Riley P.S. The only hope is to return what was taken to where it was found. Seal it away. Never speak of it. Jack read the letter twice, his hands growing cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. It had to be a hoax, right? Some kind of bizarre practical joke by the miners. Or maybe Riley went mad after seeing his friends die in the collapse. But as Jack glanced at the figurine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The house suddenly felt too large, too full of shadows and empty spaces where something could hide. Get a grip, he told himself, getting up to turn on more lights. It's just an old story. But the cave paintings had been real. The artifacts were real, and Jack couldn't explain why the metal box felt warm to the touch even in his cool kitchen, or why the dark soil inside looked damp when everything else from the mine had been bone dry. Jack took photos of everything. The box, the disc, the figurine, the letter. He tried telling himself it was for documentation, but deep down he knew it was because he was afraid these things might disappear, or that something might happen to him. That night Jack couldn't sleep. Every creak of his old farmhouse, every whisper of wind outside his window made him tense. Twice he got up to check that the front door was locked, though he knew perfectly well it was. Around 3 a.m, exhaustion finally pulled him into an uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake an hour later by a thunderous crash from downstairs. Jack sat bolt upright, heart hammering. Had someone broken in? He grabbed his phone and the baseball bat he kept beside his bed, then crept down the stairs, every sense alert. The kitchen was empty, but a chair had been knocked over, the same chair he'd been sitting in earlier. The metal box sat on the table, lid open, contents arranged neatly beside it. But something was wrong. It took Jack a moment to realize what it was. The figurine was facing a different direction than how he'd left it. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just the tick of the kitchen clock and the ever-present creaking of the old house. Jack righted the chair and approached the table, bat still raised. Nothing seemed disturbed except for the figurine. He must have bumped the table before going to bed, and the figurine had shifted when the chair fell. That had to be it, but when he went to touch the figurine to turn it back, he could have sworn it felt warm, like something recently held, and the black soil in the box definitely looked damper than before, almost like it was breathing. Jack backed away, suddenly very sure he didn't want to be near these objects anymore. Riley's letter echoed in his mind. The only hope is to return what was taken to where it was found. But the tunnel had collapsed. There was no way back to where he'd found the box, unless Jack spent the rest of the night researching. The county map showed old mine shafts scattered across the hills. Riley's letter mentioned another way in through an old shaft. If Jack could find it, maybe he could return the box and its contents to the cave. As dawn broke, Jack gathered the artifacts, carefully placing them back in the box. As he did so, he noticed something on the stone disc that he hadn't seen before, a pattern that looked remarkably like the hills around his property, with a small mark indicating what might be another entrance. It was madness to go back into those unstable tunnels, completely irrational to believe that returning some old artifacts would solve anything. But as Jack looked around his kitchen in the gray morning light, he noticed something that turned his blood to ice. All the shadows, from the table, the chairs, the countertops, were pointing toward the box as if drawn to it. And they seemed darker somehow, more solid than shadows should be. Outside, a thick fog had settled over the property, obscuring the trees at the edge of his yard. But through the mist, Jack could just make out tall, thin figures standing at the tree line, figures too tall to be human, with proportions that made his eyes hurt. The box had to go back. Today, before whatever had followed at home came any closer. Jack moved quickly, throwing supplies into his backpack: water, energy bars, first aid kit, extra batteries for his flashlight. The metal box sat on the kitchen counter, its presence seeming to fill the room even when Jack wasn't looking at it. Twice he caught himself staring at the strange figurine, mesmerized by its impossible proportions. "Focus," he muttered, shaking his head to clear it. He studied the stone disc again, comparing its markings to his property maps. If he was interpreting it correctly, there was another entrance to the cave system about a mile north of his house, near the base of the steeper hills that rose toward the state forest. Outside, the fog still hung heavy over the land, but the tall figures had vanished from the tree line. Somehow that was more unsettling than seeing them. Jack loaded his truck, placing the metal box carefully on the passenger seat. As he drove down his long driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows inside his truck were deeper than they should be, especially around the box. The drive to the northern edge of his property took longer than expected. The fog limited visibility to about 20 feet, forcing Jack to crawl along the old logging road. Twice he had to stop to check his maps and the stone disc. The second time he noticed something troubling. The soil inside the box was definitely moving, rising and falling in a slow rhythm like breathing. Finally, Jack reached a point where the road became too overgrown for his truck. He parked, shouldered his backpack, and picked up the metal box. It felt heavier than before and unnaturally warm against his hands. The hike through the woods was eerie. The fog muffled all sound, creating a bubble of silence around Jack. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the sound of his own footsteps seemed distant and unreal. The forest itself felt wrong somehow. Too still, too watchful. According to the disc and his maps, the old mine entrance should be just ahead, near the base of a limestone outcropping. Jack pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes, wincing as they scratched his arms, and emerged into a small clearing. There it was, a dark opening in the hillside, half hidden by fallen rocks and decades of plant growth. Unlike the door he'd found earlier, this entrance had no door, no lock. It was just a black hole in the earth about 4 feet high, framed by crumbling timbers. Jack hesitated at the entrance, playing his flashlight beam into the darkness. The air flowing out felt cool against his face, carrying that same mineral scent he'd noticed in the cave. He would have to crouch to enter, and the tunnel beyond looked narrower than the one he'd explored before. "This is insane," he said aloud, his voice strange in the foggy silence. But when he looked back the way he'd come, he saw only white mist with darker shapes moving within it. Tall, thin shapes that made his vision blur. The tunnel was his only option. Ducking his head, Jack entered the old mine shaft. The ceiling was low, forcing him to hunch over as he walked. This tunnel seemed older, rougher than the one he'd explored previously. The support timbers were rotted in places, and the walls showed less evidence of tool marks. Jack moved slowly, testing each step, aware that a wrong move could trigger another collapse. The metal box grew warmer in his hands, almost uncomfortably so. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, though when he looked directly at them, they remained static. After about 10 minutes of careful progress, the tunnel widened and the ceiling rose enough for Jack to stand upright. He paused, consulting the stone disc again. If he was reading it correctly, this tunnel should intersect with the cave system he'd found yesterday somewhere ahead. Jack continued forward, the beam of his flashlight sweeping the walls. Soon he began to notice changes in the rock, the same transition from man-made tunnel to natural cave that he'd seen before. The air felt different too, charged somehow, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And then he saw them. The cave paintings. Different images than before, but clearly made by the same hands. These showed the elongated figures more clearly, and depicted what looked like a ceremony of some kind, with the strange beings presenting objects to the human figures. One of the objects looked remarkably like the metal box Jack was carrying. "So you really did come from here," Jack whispered, looking down at the box. As if in response, the box suddenly grew hot, so hot that Jack gasped and nearly dropped it. The lid popped open on its own, and the objects inside began to rattle. The figurine rose first, hovering an inch above the soil. Then the stone disc lifted, spinning slowly in the air. Jack backed away, his back hitting the cave wall. The floating objects emitted a soft glow, illuminating the cave in pulsing light that made the painting seem to move. A low humming filled the air, more felt than heard, vibrating in Jack's bones. The soil in the box began to swirl, rising up in a thin column that twisted like smoke. It coalesced into a shape, a miniature version of the elongated figures from the paintings. Jack wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His breath came in short gasps as the humming grew louder. The floating objects began to orbit around each other faster and faster, their glow intensifying until he had to shield his eyes. Then, abruptly, silence. Jack lowered his arm to find the cave transformed. The walls now glowed with a faint blue luminescence, revealing a vast chamber he hadn't noticed before, and he wasn't alone. They stood in a semicircle around him, 7 tall, thin figures just like those in the paintings. In person, they were even more unsettling, their proportions fundamentally wrong in ways that made Jack's mind struggle to process what he was seeing. They weren't hostile exactly, but they weren't friendly either. They simply were, ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. One stepped forward, extending a limb too long and jointed in too many places. It pointed at the box in Jack's hands, then at a raised stone platform at the center of the chamber. The message was clear. On shaking legs, Jack approached the platform. It was carved with the same symbols as the box and the disc, arranged in concentric circles. At the center was a depression exactly the size of the metal box. Jack placed the box in the hollow. It fit perfectly, as if returning to where it had always belonged. The moment it settled into place, the symbols began to glow. Lines of light spreading outward across the floor of the chamber in complex patterns. The tall beings moved closer, arranging themselves around the platform. They began to sway in unison, a rhythmic motion that reminded Jack of reeds in the wind. The humming returned, emanating from the beings themselves. Jack stood frozen, uncertain what to do. Should he run? Stay? The beings didn't seem to be paying attention to him anymore, focused entirely on the ritual unfolding around the box. Then one turned its oversized head toward him and extended a limb, pointing back the way he had come. Another message, equally clear: leave. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He backed away from the platform, then turned and hurried toward the tunnel entrance. Behind him, the humming grew louder and the blue glow intensified, casting his shadow long and dark before him. He moved as quickly as he dared through the narrow mine tunnel, no longer worried about triggering a collapse. Whatever was happening in that chamber felt bigger than the risk of a cave-in. The fog had lifted by the time Jack emerged from the mine entrance, afternoon sunlight streaming through the trees. The forest was alive again with the sounds of birds and insects. Everything felt normal, almost jarringly so after what he'd just experienced. Jack half walked, half ran back to his truck, constantly glancing over his shoulder. But nothing followed him from the mine. When he reached his vehicle, he sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands shaking too badly to insert the key. Did that really just happen? He whispered. The drive home passed in a blur. Jack kept checking his rearview mirror, expecting to see tall figures on the road behind him. But there was nothing unusual, just the empty logging road and the familiar landscape of his property. His house looked exactly as he'd left it. Jack moved cautiously from room to room, turning on lights though it was still afternoon. Everything was in its place. The shadows were just shadows again, falling where they should, no longer seeming to reach toward anything. In the kitchen, Jack poured himself a large whiskey and drank it in one swallow. He tried to process what he'd experienced, to make sense of it within his understanding of the world. It wasn't possible. It couldn't have happened. Yet he knew it had. Over the next few days, Jack alternated between convincing himself he'd imagined the whole thing and obsessively researching any similar experiences. He found little, a few vague accounts of strange cave paintings in remote areas, some conspiracy theories about ancient non-human civilizations. Nothing solid enough to confirm what he'd seen. A week after returning the box, Jack finally worked up the courage to hike out to the first door he'd found, the one he'd broken open with bolt cutters. It was sealed again, not with a new lock, but with stone that appeared to have grown over the entrance, smooth and seamless, as if the door had never existed. 2 days later, Jack listed his house for sale. He told himself it was because the place was too big, too isolated, that he missed city life. But he knew the real reason. Every time he walked his property, he felt watched. Every time he looked at the hills, he imagined what might be dwelling beneath them, ancient and patient and awakened by his curiosity. The house sold quickly, despite its remote location. The young couple who bought it fell in love with the old farmhouse and the beautiful acres surrounding it. They asked Jack if there was anything they should know about the property. Jack thought about the door that wasn't there anymore, about the cave and its inhabitants, about the thin figures he sometimes glimpsed at the edge of his vision when night fell. Just one thing, he said finally, if you ever find something unusual on the property, something that doesn't seem quite right, leave it alone. Some things are better left undisturbed. They laughed, thinking he was joking. Jack didn't correct them. They would either heed his warning or they wouldn't. And if they didn't, well, the beings beneath the hills had been there long before any of them, and would likely remain long after. They had their own purposes, their own rules. Jack had been lucky enough to escape with a warning. Others might not be so fortunate.